All right, good morning, everybody. I won't make you guys say good morning 3 or 4 times like Shelly did. You guys did just fine. Really good to be with this group. I think this is my 3rd or 4th time speaking at the GRC Summit with Metric Stream. I always anticipate a good energy, good crowd. I feel like we all got into this space for a reason. We're doing GRC because we like to see corporations and organizations behave well. So I feel like I'm in good company whenever I come here. I will say the future-proofing GRC frameworks was a difficult assignment from Metric Stream. One, because I don't think future-proofing is really possible. And second, the idea that we could future-proof anything might mean that the world needs fewer risk managers. So with that caveat, I will say I've seen a whole lot of GRC programs. I've been covering GRC for just over 10 years now at Forrester, so I've seen a whole lot of GRC programs do very, very good things, and I've seen a whole lot of struggles. So the information I'll be talking about today is really from that perspective. What have we seen in the market? What are the big trends going on in GRC? How are they affecting GRC programs specifically? And then I'll talk a little bit about this future-proofing idea. What kind of infrastructure can you build? What kind of culture, things like that, to make sure that your GRC program is resilient? You've heard throughout the day, and you hear daily, really, in publications and online, the world's changing. Technology is changing, there's digital disruption, there's geopolitical issues. I'm not really going to go into a whole lot of that. You guys hear that plenty. What I'm going to talk about is how do you build a resilient GRC program that can basically stay strong in the midst of all that change. And hopefully I can move forward here. If I could get some help with the clicker, I'd appreciate it. Or if you could just move the slides forward, that'd be good too. So I will say, again, some of the trends that you've heard. Oh, that's not quite right. Some of the trends that you've heard already, digital disruption. I will say my colleague Nick Hayes tomorrow is speaking on IT and technology risks. So if you get a chance, go to his presentation tomorrow in the morning. He'll be talking about DDoS attacks and ransomware and things like that. So I don't want to get into necessarily big discussion on technology trends, but I will discuss 2 different trends that are affecting GRC that you probably haven't heard about too much. Business and technology things that are going on. And based on our Forrester data, we have, I think, really good insight into some of these business things that might impact your organizations, and specifically in the GRC space. All right, so the first one is value is all about intangible assets. Some of you may have seen this really, really interesting study. This came out in a book about 3 years ago, looking at the corporate value that's associated with companies in the S&P 500. What percentage of that value is tied to intangible assets? So back in early 70s, it was 17%. And that 17% represented things like intellectual property, brand, and goodwill. And not too surprisingly, we've seen these companies come out recently that have massive valuations that are relatively young, right? This valuation's not about having a lot of products in the warehouse, a lot of parts on the conveyor belts in their facilities. It's about brand and reputation. So now, this was actually 4 years ago, 88% of corporate value in the S&P 500 was tied to intangible assets. And you think of companies like Uber and Airbnb and Google and Tesla. Tesla's recently surpassed the other auto manufacturers as #1 most valued in the country. Is it because they had the most facilities, the most cars on the road, the most cars in warehouses about to ship? Or was it their brand and intellectual property? So this is huge for risk managers, right? If the idea of GRC is about helping build and protect your corporate value, and 88% of that value, not for everybody, but on average, 88% of that value is tied to intangible assets, are you spending enough time with your GRC program focusing on those intangible assets? And I'll get into more on that later. The second technology trend that I wanted to talk about was tech spending. Now, Forrester has, I think we're second only to the US Census in the amount of consumer data we have. And around the world, we keep track of technology spending in all categories. B2B, C, government, countries around the world. We have tens of thousands of technology decision makers that answer our surveys on this. And we've noticed for the last 4 years a big trend of spending in technology, going from what we call IT, back-end systems, things that keep the lights on, keep businesses running efficiently. IT, moving to business technology. Now, business technology is anything that helps a company win, serve, and retain customers. So think mobile apps, social media campaigns, marketing automation, in-store kiosks, anything that you see in the store, in your house, in your car, in your pocket, that's business technology. So we've seen a big shift in spending from IT to BT. Now, to get into the data a little bit more, a little bit hard to see, but you'll notice the 2 lines here. So business technology is up on the top, information technology is on the bottom. So this is new project spending. So on average, across all industries, across all company sizes, about 3 years ago, there was a flip-flop. So now, this is the wrong place to stand, just so you guys know. So now, more money is being spent on technology for new projects that are customer-facing, right? So anything that's helping win, serve, and retain customers. So if you're a bank, if you're an insurance company, if you're a healthcare company, if you're a manufacturer, airlines, any of those companies, your company is going through this shift. Maybe you're a little bit behind, maybe a little bit ahead of the curve, but you're shifting to technologies that are helping win, serve, and retain customers, externally facing things. And that's why some of these startups are moving so quick. That's why they're so agile. They don't have this big sort of legacy technology debt, all these back-end systems. They outsource that and spend all of their money, time, and attention and innovation on engagement, right? Great mobile apps. That's why Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, one of the reasons they're so successful, they spend their technology focus on engagement rather than the back-end systems. Now, very important for GRC people to think about. If you're thinking about technology risk, CISOs, people that are involved in business continuity, access control, most of the time they're thinking access control, business continuity for back-end systems, right? Your big SAP and Oracle environments, your CRM, your ERP, all of those sort of back-end systems, that's good, but there's a whole lot of risk in the customer-facing systems, half of the budget of which is going to those systems, that people are not paying enough attention to. All right, so those are the 2 overarching trends. Now, I want to get into some of the GRC implications of those trends. Now, this is a 5-year vision. I think future-proofing or predicting outside of 5 years is very difficult. So these are the things that we are seeing right now that we expect to really impact GRC professionals over the next 5 years. Again, based on all our data and our experience helping businesses build their GRC programs. So the first one is regulators who have been used to playing catch-up are falling out of the race completely. Now, we've seen this with regulators before. They're always a little bit behind, right? Sarbanes-Oxley, reactionary. Dodd-Frank, reactionary, right? Most of the time, regulators are going to respond to big risk events, things that hurt consumers or citizens. That's always been the case. But now, they're not even able to keep up. So the first bullet here, hyper-adoption, is exposing risk before regulators can intervene. So we're seeing this with a couple examples that, Uber and Airbnb come up all the time, so I apologize for using those as examples. But if you think about how quickly they spread, the regulators, the jurisdictions, the cities, the states, even some nations were trying to get out ahead. They didn't know how to regulate Uber, didn't know how to regulate Airbnb. Now, a couple examples, but one of my favorite happened almost a year ago. So does anybody remember when Pokemon Go came out? Does anybody use Pokemon Go? Is anybody using it right now? Couple, okay. So Pokemon Go came out just almost a year ago. And at the time, the state of New York had a law on the books that said, if you are a sexual predator on parole, you cannot use social media. Makes sense. So Pokemon Go came out, and Pokemon Go is not a social media network, right? It has many of the same characteristics, but it was not covered by that law. So to its credit, New York State said, okay, we need to revise the law, make sure that Pokemon Go is covered, apps like Pokemon Go is covered. And to their credit, I think within about 4 weeks, they rewrote the law, had it on the books. Pretty impressive. Meanwhile, 25 million people had downloaded that app. So kids were going online talking about where they live, where they like to hang out, where they're going that evening, if they're going to be around other people. They're putting themselves at risk before regulators could even knew Pokemon Go was about to come out, right? So we have 25 million people using this potentially dangerous app the regulators had no idea about. So that's hyper adoption, and it's happening with Uber, Airbnb, but it's also with some of these new apps coming out, putting people at risk before regulators can intervene. We're seeing that with driving cars as well, right? So the second one, companies are making ethical calls without regulatory guidance. So think about, in the last year, some of the conversation about driverless cars. Now, in some cases, a driverless car has to be programmed to make decisions, so to speak. Let's say the car's in a skid, it has to correct. Does it correct to save the driver, or does it correct to save the pedestrians? It's not gonna happen too often, but we have to think about that. We have to program some sort of algorithm, some sort of decision with how is that car going to react. There's no regulatory body involved that's helping make that decision. So you saw Mercedes over the last year actually had multiple accounts of people coming out saying, this is how we're approaching this, or this is how we're approaching. So very clear that those conversations are not even happening within the manufacturing companies, let alone with the regulators. And then finally, authorities are blocking new business models. So you saw this with driverless cars in California. They're actually fighting with the DMV for just the right to use the road for testing. You saw that with Airbnb. Jurisdictions either blocked it or restricted its use. Uber, same way. They couldn't figure out how to tax it, how to regulate it. They're just saying, we don't want you here. Now that strikes me as not just reactionary, more panic mode, right? We don't know what to do with this, we're just going to shut it off. So regulators are becoming less and less part of that conversation. So number two, kind of counter to that, customers are becoming more of that conversation. Customers are putting more pressure on corporate behavior than regulators. We expect this to continue or increase over the next 5 years. So it's just starting to happen, but in 5 years, this will be a big impact. So first, consumers they're rallying on issues that were approved by regulators. So over the last few years, we saw this, actually, I think I saw French earlier, he always talks about that case. There was a young woman in Oklahoma or Kansas that created a viral campaign for Powerade and Gatorade to remove an orange chemical from their products. USDA said it's okay, but there was a grassroots viral campaign that got the companies to remove that chemical. There was the pink slime case. So there was sort of reconstituted beef products that were showing up in school lunches and grocery stores. USDA says no problem, but it showed up on the news. There was a viral campaign. A lot of angry parents got it out of school lunches. The manufacturer that actually made that product had to shut 3 of their 4 plants down, fire about 3,000 workers. Now that case has just come up again because that company is suing ABC for libel, saying they used terms like pink slime that were derogatory. Pink slime, I think, fits the case of derogatory. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. That's for the jury to decide. But another recent case that I found really important and also interesting in the last couple of days, there was a case in Idaho. There's a third-party contractor that does Medicare evaluations to see who's covered by Medicare. They were using big data. I think they put it into like a bunch of really complicated spreadsheets, and they put out information that said, based on this patient's characteristics, here's the cap on their coverage. Now the ACLU said, wait a minute, if you're making those kind of decisions, we want to see the transparency behind what goes into those decisions. It can't just be some big data goes into a spreadsheet or goes into some sort of big data analytics and comes out and says, you don't get covered for this. That needs to be transparent. And now that it's transparent, the judge actually said, yes, it has to be transparent. And now the ACLU is looking through that set of big data analytics and saying, you're making mistakes in how people are covered. You're making decisions that are poorly reflective of policy. So here we have a great case. So this is healthcare regulation. It's third party. It's over-reliance on technology. And it has regulatory approval. The only reason this came up was because ACLU said, wait a minute, we need to check this out. And by the way, when we think about consumers are rallying on issues that earn regulatory approval, when the Trump administration won the election back in November, within the next about 6 months, ACLU is recording record donations. So there's a lot of discussion about who do consumers trust. Is it regulators? Is it government? Is it media? Is it corporations? They're pouring money into corporate watchdogs, consumer watchdogs like ACLU, Sierra Club also, record donations, right? So it's not the regulators, it's not the government that are stepping in, it's consumers saying, we need to take a look at this, we're going to throw money at watchdogs to help regulate corporate behavior. A really interesting case here. And then from a B2B perspective, any of you guys that work at a B2B company have seen these third-party requirements start to ramp up, right? Over the last 3-4 years especially. You'll hear a lot about third-party risk over the next couple of days. I would say almost all of the third-party risk attention is helping very large companies ask more questions to their vendors and third parties. So the regulators are requiring more diligence, the technology vendors and the service providers are helping those big companies ask more questions, being very efficient. Meanwhile, if you're a service company, if you're a tech company, any B2B company that has to sell to those big companies, you're getting hit over the head with dozens of questionnaires a day, sometimes 400, 500, 600 questions. I work a lot with CISOs. They said that the technology risk questions that they're getting from their third parties or from their business-to-business customers and their prospects far outweigh the pain from the regulators. So this is a huge deal in B2B. And then, of course, technology is helping customers align specific values. So on the B2B side, most of the technology vendors in the space are really pushing the pressure down to the respondents. But also on the consumer side, we have things like Yelp and Angie's List, but there are new startups that are coming out that give you an app. You can walk down the grocery store and you can take a picture and say, I want to know the corporate social responsibility or sustainability metrics that I care about and how this company does. If I do a comparison between 2 brands of mustard or 2 brands of butter or milk, I can say, this one was ethically sourced or locally sourced, or they donated to a political action committee that I like or don't like. You can make those decisions on your phone with these new apps. So that kind of behavior is really going to be important for a risk professional and a compliance professional. It's not just compliance with regulations that matters, it's compliance with your third-party requirements, your customer requirements. All right, and then the last one, I started to talk about the valuation that's going into intangible assets. So I'll go through this one very quickly. But rising intangible assets is causing risk to skyrocket. So it's changing the nature of risk, right? So maybe your operational risks are not necessarily as important as some of your reputation risk damages, but it's certainly changing enough to pay attention to. So firms are extracting more data from intangible assets. A whole lot of these startups, I'm based in San Francisco, so I keep seeing these new startups that help you order a personal valet service to park your car, order food to your house, order somebody else to cook it, order somebody else to clean up. A lot of those companies are not profitable. In some cases, they're not even charging that much. It's all about collecting data. So they're pulling all this data to sell or to use in other ways. That's a huge amount of risk and huge amount of value that doesn't fall into our traditional ideas of operational risk. It's also creating new compliance headaches. So how do you use that data? With the GDPR coming out next year, all the enforcement coming out next year, how do you store that data? How do you use it? How do you collect it? How do you, maintain an ability to be forgotten if a customer says, we don't want to associate with this company anymore? Huge compliance headaches there. And then finally, reputational impact can be a whole lot greater. So the idea of reputational risk, I like to stay away from, actually. Reputation, in my mind, is not a separate category of risk. Reputation is a category of impact from other risks. So we have just a couple examples. I mean, don't pay too much attention to the categories, but information security risks, financial, third-party risk, all of those, if there's a risk event, can have a regulatory impact, financial impact, operational, and in many cases, a huge reputational impact, right? Think about the big losses that we've seen, the big risk events that made the news. Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, Uber has had a couple of them, right? So United Airlines, right? A lot of these cases, there might be a regulatory fine, right? So Wells Fargo was hit with, I can't remember, $130 million settlement. But the reputation damage over the last year has been much greater. Volkswagen, Huge, huge reputational impact. Certainly the regulatory impact's massive. I don't want to discredit that. United Airlines, is there going to be regulatory issues there? Maybe operational, maybe, but the reputational impact is massive. The target breach a couple years ago. Yeah, I can't remember the regulatory fines, minimal, right? So their stock price came back up in 6 months, but the reputational damage immediately, because they were breached over the right before the Christmas holiday, they lost hundreds of millions because people said, I just don't want to shop there right now. So the reputation damage for most of these is far, far greater than the regulatory or operational. So this is a study from Harvard Business Review that came out just 2 years ago. It looked at the amount of time that risk managers spend on different categories of risk. Really, really interesting study. So over here, if you guys can see this on either side, so at the top is how much time they spend on each of these categories. So a whole lot of time on operational risk and financial reporting. Does that sound familiar? A whole lot of companies spend a lot of time on Sarbanes-Oxley controls, on op risk. Those are important, right? We're not discrediting the time, because a lot of those compliance issues can have other risks like inability to operate as a business, right? A lot of compliance programs are very important for that reason. Also, if you're in health and safety, it's not about losses, it's about protecting individuals. So I don't want to say stop doing operational risk or stop doing financial controls. But as far as corporate loss, they're saying that 88% of corporate losses are due to strategic risks. Things like your partnerships, protecting your brand, keeping up with market transitions, digital disruption, things like that. So if you think about your GRC program, maybe you don't go to 88%. But are you at 30% right now, 40%? How much of your time is looking at these strategic risks? My guess is very few. All right, so building your GRC infrastructure, how do you future-proof against some of these trends? How do you build an infrastructure of GRC that's resilient to these trends? So the GRC maturity curve, I've been talking about this for 7 or 8 years. And in all honesty, maybe some of you have seen me use this slide before. I keep thinking that that red star is going to move. It's moved maybe 1.5 inches over the 7 years, 8 years I've been using it. We keep thinking we're going to have all this automation, right? We're going to have BI and analytics. We're going to have control enforcement that's automatic, right? The way you email, the way you do financial transactions, your customer interactions, all that's going to be, it's going to have automated controls that will be enforced in every transaction. That's not happening, right? We're spending a whole lot of time on the bottom on documentation, and we're starting to get into business process with an eye toward automation. But one of the reasons is because most of the advancements on this maturity curve are because of new and changing regulations. There's a new law, there's a new rule that comes out, or maybe with the new administration, we have to roll back a couple rules. Dodd-Frank goes away a little bit, and then maybe in 4 years, maybe in 8 years, it starts to come back again. So we're going back and forth a whole lot. It's not about necessarily new regulations, it's about changing regulations. But when that happens, we're spending too much time. It's hard, it's maybe not too much time. I say too much focus on the exact rules and laws and saying, okay, we need to change this business process. Here are a list of 30 business processes we have to go through the regulatory change management and make sure all those happen. Instead of building an infrastructure to say, we know that changes are going to come about. We know over the next 3 years, 5 years, we don't know how it's going to change, but we know we need a really good regulatory change management process as infrastructure to deal with new changes. And maybe that is actually more important than some of the individual controls that we have to worry about. And that will eventually put us up above into the more automated controls if we spend time on the middle two, or on the middle and the bottom. So let me show you what I mean by the infrastructure, right? The basics of GRC. So GRC really consists of 4 key components with inputs and outputs. The fundamental, the bread and butter, the heart and soul, whatever metaphor you use, the base, the fundamentals of GRC is that GRC framework. That's what makes GRC different than compliance management, risk management, and any of the other related elements, audit, is that you're tying these different groups, these different items together. If you have a control, let's say a privacy control, you need that privacy control to account for your HIPAA requirement or for your 48 or 47 different state privacy requirements. Let's say your your breach notification process fulfills HIPAA and it fulfills 47 state requirements. You can also use that for GDPR. GDPR is a little bit more strict. You have to ratchet that back down to, I think it's 48 hours. But you can show that this requirement is fulfilled by your existing control. That's why GRC matters. And also, by the way, it fulfills a reputation risk because the sooner you respond to an event, the more information you have when you respond, the less reputation damage there's going to be. So that's the fundamentals of GRC. Now around that we have content management. So all of your documents, your policies, your audit findings, anything that's written down, very, very important. We know no matter which way regulations go, documenting your controls and your policies, having a good handle on what those policies are and when, massively important. Next, there will be workflow management. All of your assessments, your audits, your remediations, your action items, your regulatory change management. That basically says, here's how we navigate around the GRC framework and the content. This is how people get involved in the program. Now, of course, with these three things, you'll have inputs and outputs, right? So some manual inputs, filling out self-assessments, filling out audits, your work papers and so forth. And then you'll have outputs, communication, and your integration with other systems. And then, of course, reporting would be the fourth. So you've got your framework, your content management workflow, and reporting. That's your GRC infrastructure, and you've got inputs and outputs. Now, right now, most of the innovation, most of the investment is happening in GRC platform reporting and inputs. I would say not enough is happening in inputs. So reporting is very helpful, right? You're getting all this information out of your system. You're using that system to make important decisions. That's the most important aspect of your GRC program is, can we use it to make good decisions? Well, increasingly, you can't do that without better input. Risk and control self-assessments are great and very important, but do you know what's going on in between those self-assessments? If you do a self-assessment once a year, 3 times a year, 4 times a year, that's not a whole lot of visibility to what's going on the front lines. You're not watching what are people saying on Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, and you're not paying attention to what's going on in the market. You're not paying attention to reputation damage, right? Your risk assessments, control assessments that goes across, let's say 5,000 people in your organization. Are they thinking about strategic risks? Probably not. And then reporting, eventually, you should be spending time here as well, but it's the infrastructure. It's getting a really good, flexible, and agile GRC framework and having good inputs into that framework so you can monitor for these other risks that you're not paying attention to right now. Now, a big part of that input is also the culture, right? Just as the regulators can't keep up with new policies, new oversight, with new technologies, none of us can either, right? If we're a chief compliance officer or chief risk officer, we don't know all the different ways our frontline staff is using technologies. I mean, do you guys know how some of your younger staff might be using WhatsApp to discuss maybe patient data? I mean, things like that are happening quite a bit, and you can't get all of that with automated inputs, right? You're not tracking everybody's phone. WhatsApp is encrypted anyway, so you can't really monitor what's going on in those conversations. So you have to build a culture where people understand what are those risks and compliance responsibilities. So this has to be more about fostering cultural change, and I'm sure you've heard this quite a bit, but none of the technologies you'll hear about, none of the technology risks or technology capabilities will help if you don't have this in place. This is going to be where you see a new app, let's say something like Pokemon Go comes out and a whole lot of people adopt it. Well, no one's going to necessarily run that up into a GRC platform unless there's a culture to say, wait a minute, this looks like a risk. As a frontline staff, I care about our customers, I care about our data, I should go tell somebody about this thing that's happening. That's going to help you identify new and emerging risks far more than any kind of technology. So discuss risk at the highest levels. Reinforce that risk is not a bad thing. We see this all the time. People getting into a room like this and doing a workshop and saying, well, I don't want to talk about risk because it looks like I'm doing a bad job if I've got a risk in my part of the organization. You have to change that mindset. Have managers require risk input and consideration, so make it part of their day-to-day or maybe say weekly team meetings. What risks have you seen? What's not looking quite right? You don't even have to use the word risk. If you walk into a sales organization, say, hey, is it looking like maybe our pipeline's not doing so well, or our conversion rate's not good for some reason? Maybe there's a brand reputational impact or issue that you didn't know about. So talk about things in their terms. Tie risks to their objectives. So if it's a sales team, they're all about conversions, right? They're all about pipeline. If it's the HR department, they're all about bringing in good talent, getting them provisioned to systems, and getting them working right away. So say, well, what are the access control issues that I can help overcome as a risk manager to help you get people into those systems faster? We can help you do background checks faster. So create a culture where people understand risk and compliance involvement is helpful for them. All right, so getting people involved, similar, right? So tailor the message and training for each audience, right? If you're talking to customer service staff, they have a whole lot of risk exposure, and they probably don't think in terms of risk. They think in terms maybe of rules. So create a culture where they understand, like, you guys are the front line to our brand. Our brand and our reputation is the most important thing in our company. You guys hold the engagement with clients. This is very important to our business. That's why we created these rules. Anticipate undesired responses. I've talked to a bunch of companies that say, over the next 6 months, or over the next, let's say 2 years, we're trying to reduce our risk. Well, that can lead to reducing the risk that's reported. And I've seen many cases where they say, well, we just stopped reporting all the risks, which is the opposite outcome, right? So instead, say our number one objective is to have great risk visibility, right? We're trying to increase the number of risks that we identify and the way we measure them and talk about them. So anticipate that people might not always react to rules or requirements the same way. Focus on positive outcomes. Again, how can we help you do your job better? If you have to keep asking people to do their self-assessments, to read their policies and stuff over and over again, they'll maybe do it, but if you give them a reason to come into the system and say, if I fill out this assessment, I'm gonna get helpful data back. I need to be involved, I wanna be involved, so I can get maybe we lost power? Oh, all right. Interesting. Well, maybe that's a background risk that we haven't talked enough about. That's all right, thank you. And then the last one is using existing communication channels. So the idea of training, it's not just sending out an hour online courseware every month or every quarter. You use different channels, right? Have the CEO say something about it. Have something in the new hire, have something in team meetings, just reinforce messages that these are the risks that we care about, or these are the values that we care about. Create, again, that culture. The key takeaway here is that the technology is not going to do it for you. It will do a whole lot of it. It will help you with your visibility, with your data collection. But if you don't have people that understand they need to be involved, they need to keep their eye out for things that don't look quite right, they need to keep values in mind when they talk to customers or other stakeholders, you're not going to get that kind of visibility. And then finally, just a couple of key takeaways. Assume that risk and compliance is always going to be in flux, right? It's not just about regulations going up. It's not just about risk going up. Maybe it's going to go down. It's just always changing, right? Your third-party ecosystem, your business models, everything's changing. So invest in capabilities that will help you move through change, not capabilities that will help you necessarily respond to this set of requirements and then next set of requirements, because that's only going to last a couple years. Next is follow the money. So if you haven't already, align your risk and compliance efforts to where your company has value, the things that you're supposed to protect, and where it's making money. All these technology projects that I mentioned that are all going external, they're all helping win, serve, and retain customers. Focus your GRC efforts on that. It actually helps you as well. You get more visibility, more budget, maybe more authority in the organization if you're helping your marketing people, your customer service, your salespeople achieve their objectives. You can show, look, GRC is strategic. It's not just about cutting cost. It's about how do we go to market in a way that's safe, that's going to protect our brand. And then finally, create a greater skill and agility by getting people involved. You cannot be in every conversation. You cannot choose every third party. You can't be there when a customer service rep answers the phone to remind them of policies. You'll create that culture so people understand this is what we value, this is what we care about, and therefore, this is how we expect you to behave. So here's my email address. Always happy to carry on the conversation. Email me with questions if you want to set up a time to talk, ask questions, anything like that. Always happy to carry on the conversation. For right now, any questions while I'm here? I have 3 minutes and 30 seconds to stand awkwardly until somebody asks a question. Do we have one back there? Oh.
Hi, Knut Ullman from TCF Bank. When you were talking about the fact that 6% of the time from risk management professionals is spent on strategic risk, and that accounts for 88% of the losses, you said that was from a Harvard Business Review article?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I wrote that down right so that I can give it to my manager.
And I believe you'll have access to this slide, so we do reference that specific article in the slide.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So quick question for you. One of the things I think the scene is, along with the rapidity of all of the changes in the external environment, are the internal environments where organizations are cycling people through, either from the outside in or from the inside out. Have you seen any best practices for people being able to accelerate bringing people up to speed? So it's how do you get the front end of that agility curve started? Any good suggestions there?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So the question is, have we seen best practices for dealing with internal change? A number of people cycling through, spending less time within a job. I don't have the same kind of data on that. I will say the emphasis that I have on culture, we spend a lot of time looking at regulatory fines, regulatory enforcement action, and we see a lot of times it's not just a one-time bad actor. It's not that causes a big fine. It's when the regulator comes in and sees there's a pattern or an environment of malpractice or malfeasance. So Wells Fargo, for example, my assumption is they probably had a whole lot of people cycling through that part of the organization, but there was a general ecosystem or environment of malfeasance. So you're creating the culture where managers talk about, this is what we care about, these are our policies, this is why we have policies, having the tone at the top, having a lot more ways to get input from the front lines. If you're tracking things like in your CRM system, has there been an abnormal spike in the average number of accounts per clients? I can't say if you had done this, you would have stopped that risk event from happening. But making sure you're collecting a lot of data, you're giving employees a reason and a channel to highlight potential risk events or concerns, those are best practices that are generally going to help you mitigate risks of that quick turnover. You have 1 minute, just one more here.
Sorry. On the strategic risk, do you have any recommendations in terms of sort of process or products or workflow in terms of how to sort of monitor that? Because I think that I was very interested in what you were saying, but it's harder to see how that's integrated into current systems.
Yeah, the tough part is integrating the bottom up and the top down, but I do workshops with clients on strategic risk, and I almost always start with the ISO 31000 standard. The first, it's a very approachable standard. I think it's only about 27 pages. The first section is establish the context, where you document what is our focus for risk management, why are we here, what are our objectives, and then very specifically we say, what are the organizational objectives that we're hoping to protect. So from a strategic perspective, most organizations are going to say, we care about customer loyalty, we care about product quality, we care about those types of things. And so start there and say, okay, what are all the uncertainty type events that could impact our ability to achieve the objective of increased customer loyalty or increased margin or increased shareholder value, things like that. So starting at that top and using ISO as ISO 31000 as a framework to start is the best approach that I've seen so far. Real quick, one more. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Chris. You had talked earlier about the evolution and the direction moving forward, I believe, to business performance. but the arrow and the star has not been moving very quickly recently.
Yeah.
I saw a study that indicated that risk identification, risk monitoring, and risk reporting, people feel like they're doing an awesome job of that.
Sure.
However, the risk response, actually creating treatment plans and answering that question, are we doing enough, was severely low in people's confidence. And without that risk response improving, how do you see the evolution becoming stronger and going that direction?
Yeah. So we've got a report that we're working on right now, very similar results that say of the top reasons, here are the top 10 reasons that risk management's not going too well. We don't have time to take a vote, but if you think about the number one response risk managers say risk management's not moving forward, their top answer is, it's doing just fine. We have no barriers. I don't believe them. The next four responses, the next four most common responses were we don't have enough resources, we don't get enough priority, there's other projects that take priority. My assumption, and we're digging into the data, my assumption is because they're not tying that response to value. They're saying, I have a laundry list of all the different business continuity risks or all the different HR risks, and we have all of these remediation action plans just waiting for somebody to pick up. And we just need the budget for it. Well, minimizing risk events is a very hard concept, right? We do this for a living, but if you walk into HR and say, here are 30 things that we think you need to do better, it's a hard conversation. I think if you walk in and say, we know what you're in business to do, right? You're trying to get the best and brightest talent, bring them in, get them trained, provisioned to systems, and get them in the workforce as quick as possible. Now, I've got 30 ways I think I can help you do your job better. And we can be partners in this, right? We'll invest some, you'll invest some, and you'll think about it in terms of reducing risk. But they'll think about it in terms of, awesome, we just took our time to hire from 3 months down to 2.5 months because we have a better background check process. So I think tying the risks to value is the only way you're going to get people to stand up and say, that sounds like a great project, I'll sponsor that or I'll invest in that. So the risk response, if we keep saying, yelling at people about how risky their business unit or process is, it's a hard conversation to get them excited about, right? So hopefully that'll help. I am out of time, guys. Really appreciate the time and attention. Take care.